Welcome to the Real Life Buyer podcast. In this podcast, you will hear interviews with business owners, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, authors, and technical specialists in their field. These professionals will hasten your development, accelerate your career, and broaden your business know-how. Now, introducing your host, Dave Barr, interviewing with a purchasing twist.
Hello, and welcome to the Real Life Buyer. Today, I delve into a powerful theme of acceptance without understanding. My guest today is Cynthia Fortlage, a transgender woman with over 3 decades of corporate experience. Cynthia brings a unique perspective on fostering a sense of belonging for all genders in the workplace. In this thought-provoking conversation, I seek to explore how acceptance, without the need for complete understanding, can and should reshape professional relationships. So, without further ado, I welcome Cynthia onto the podcast. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you
Good.
very much. Just before Christmas for us, but yes, by the time this goes out, we'll be well past that date. But there we go. Now,
Wonderful.
we met a little while ago now on a virtual networking event, and I've been inspired by your strength and commitment in the face of, some may say, your personal situation. Would you help my audience take a peek into your journey from being a VP of Information Technology as a man who changed genders and transformed into a celebrated speaker and pioneer of diversity and inclusion?
Yeah. Wow. Pioneer. That's a strong word, but thank you. Yeah. So for the audience, what Dave's referring to was that, like many people, I was married. We had 2 kids, a son and a daughter. The kids are now, son's 30, daughter's 26, both live in Canada, hence this accent. But I'm actually Belfast by birth. So I'm actually British by birth. And so coming back to London in 2020 via South America was just, again, a very squiggly life that brought me back to the UK, where I now call home. But really through the first 50 years of my life, you're right, I enjoyed that perception of being male, while, as I talk about in the work that I do with corporate clients and so forth these days, I talk about the idea that, the identity that I've always had, I was born with it. I like to say Lady Gaga was right. I was born this way. And it was really that iteration that I forced to put it away to comply with everyone else's desire of what they wanted from me so that I could be that person without actually ever knowing how to be that person. And then at the age of 50, 3 things collided. Very simply, my youngest was completing the high school regime. And for those that have children in school, you know that you become their parent. So you're known as your child's parent, and you almost lost a part of your identity. And I was getting that part back. And it was like, okay, well, who am I? I also happen to be 50 years old, which many will probably see as a very reflective point of our life. And I was reflecting on who am I? And the final piece was I was on a bit of a health mission at that point. I went through a couple of failed attempts to kickstart that. And it was on the 3rd attempt where I had finally started to reconcile what I'd hidden since I was young. And the earliest recollection that I have is at 4 years old, being told to kind of man up, be the boy you're supposed to be. And I can only take from that I must have been showing and expressing very feminine ways of behaving that was seen as not appropriate. And of course, when I say that, at 4 years old, we're talking late 60s, early 70s. So a very different time than it is today. And so I had learned to package it up. And it was actually through that life cycle, what I had gotten really good at was trying to figure out what was considered a good male behavior, see someone that had that behavior and copy it, not actually having an innate sense of what that behavior was. And so that's what I did all the way through until through my career, I ended up achieving, as you said, the title of Vice President of IT, Information Technology / CIO, Chief Information Officer. And so I had an executive level role. I was in that. I had been 28 years on the job. And, related to your core theme, it was actually in the supply chain industry. So I spent, 30 years in that space. but from a technology perspective, not necessarily an operational perspective, although at times the software drives it. So you do have to get into the trees. But the reality was that as those three life events kind of collided, I started to have the mind space to kind of, figure out who I was. And in that came up this really kind of old buried history that I could no longer hide and I had to deal with. I went and I was blessed to have a wonderful therapist, counselor that they would probably say here in the UK that I worked with. And in doing so, that person really helped me kind of figure out. And when I say that, it took 6 weeks to go from zero to moving out of the marital home and actually beginning to what we call socially live my life. Very quickly, through the next 3 years, I was a working executive still, and I was transitioning on the job into a female executive, which brings up a whole bunch of interesting stories of what is it like to be a woman in the corporate space compared that I actually had a comparison to what it was like to be a male in that space. Obviously, there's lots of personal life things that were going on, disowned by family, lost my marriage. And really, for the first year, my children only communicated about 3 hours with me. We've children and I have rebuilt the relationships, but with my ex, even though we had 32 years of marriage, 28 of them, quote, fairly good, we have no communication. And I still have really no communication with my birth family. So that's kind of a short version of that. Along the way, I pivoted my career from the technology side into the diversity field. I moved from living in Canada or growing up in Canada because it was actually the Troubles in the early 70s that chased my family away. That's why I grew up in Canada. And then, as I said, it was through a very squiggly journey coming after living, actually the first part of lockdown, COVID lockdown that we all went through. I actually spent it living in South America. And once we were able to leave, I ended up coming to the UK to deal with all of the various government paperwork associated with my identity. And I thought I would be here for 6 months, but living in London, it's a big city. I'm a small town Canadian prairie girl, and I fell in love with the big city. And so that's why I pivoted and brought my career and basically started building. So when we met, I was continually working on networking and really extending the relationships and bringing the insights that I have from 3 decades of corporate experience, as well as the last 8 years in the diversity space, and really trying to help folks understand what that looks like for women, for men, for LGBTQ, and of course, trans folks within a workspace. And that's what I do today.
Ah, it's fascinating. Now, you mentioned as a young boy
Yeah.
that you were copying other people, the perception of what was right for your gender. Now, I'm interested to know, at that time, who would you say would have been a good role model for you? Who was your role model? And who would that be now?
Great question. So the reality was there was no one person. Clearly, at that point, my father was a big part of my life. But I wouldn't say necessarily that his behaviors were the ones, because if I'm in, primary school, secondary school, he's not there and he's obviously not young. So I had to look at other boys to figure out how they were behaving and try and copy it. And it never fit. It never really worked. I guess you could say that very much I had a persona that was very kind of beta male. If we think kind of in an alpha male culture, a very beta male. And so I got really good at copying it. Obviously, I enjoyed, quote, all the success that comes from male privilege in that life. But the reality is I had no idea what I was doing. I was just copying. And so when I get into, for instance, business, I would look at, people who were my mentors. I would look at bosses and so forth. And it was like picking and choosing from everybody in order to do it. And the same very much happens today. I mean, my daughter is clearly as one of the closest females in my life. She very much is a huge influence, but, we don't see each other every day. She lives in Canada. But it's really just the interaction. But what has changed was in the male behavior, I would see the male behavior and copy the male behavior. And today, what happens if there was something and I'm not sure, and I see female behavior, is I take it away and I process it to how do I authentically show that? Or is it even authentically something that belongs to me? And so I've learned this skill of rather than copying, actually analyzing and processing and making it my own. And it could also mean that it doesn't fit. To give you I was a very initially, almost 8 years ago, very pink, frilly, girly girl. And I would say I'm very much kind of in the middle. You meet me at a business event, I'm going to be very professionally dressed and so forth. But, not every aspect has to be perfect girly girl for me anymore. I have found myself. I have found my style. I have found what makes me authentically me. And I adhere to that because I now understand what that actually means. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe so, yes.
Yeah.
In your work, you refer to this statement I made in the introduction, acceptance without understanding. Now, I take it that's your path towards a more inclusive society. Now, for people who don't really understand the context of that statement, can you
Yeah.
explain what the essence of that phrase means and share perhaps examples of how your teachings have positively impacted perhaps a male dominated work culture and the results that you've seen as an outcome of that work?
Absolutely. So let me take your audience back to the founding of the idea when it came to me. It came to me when my marriage was dissolving, and then all I can say is that after the number of years that we had, there was no doubt there was love between my partner. I have no doubt, and I would say we still care for each other. We just don't love each other anymore, and certainly through our kids, we have this common co-parenting responsibility, even though they're adults. They're still our children. And the idea was that in that moment when we were working through couples therapy, we had defined the values of what makes a strong relationship for us. And we defined it as 10 bricks. If you think of a wall and you start and you put your foundational bricks, the children were one of them. The children we absolutely agreed on. There was no debate about that brick. It was solid. Every other brick that we had decided upon that we worked through one at a time through therapy, the answer unfortunately came that it was a no. When we looked at compromise, when we tried to find a middle ground to all of this, the answers very simply were no. It was, I had to adhere to my spouse's way or no way. And it really occurred to me that at that point, we probably were never going to do it. And the reality for your audience was, my ex, she's not a lesbian. So to be in a relationship with me as I am today would mean she's a lesbian. And that's not her. So, as difficult as it was, that's when we began the process of divorce, when I realized that it wasn't there. So now I was naive enough at that point to think this idea of acceptance would just apply to me in that moment. And then I started to realize that it actually was much bigger than that. And that it applied to the entire LGBTQ plus community. And depending what stat, we're talking anywhere between 16 to 20% of the population. And then based upon my own identity, I realized, oh, well, it applies to all women because women are the largest group of marginalized people in the planet and obviously the workforce today. And those are my own lived experiences. And I realized that, hang on, this actually applies to everyone who is marginalized within society, which is lots of people. Quite simply. And the idea simply says that the society today says, and we're trained through, preschool, we're asking, hey, why is this? Why is that? You go into school and it's a why, because we're learning. And why is a question we ask to gain understanding. And therefore, as a society, and certainly as a technologist at the time, we had a troubleshooting technique called the 7 Why technique, which was all about getting to root cause analysis in solving a problem. And that was all about, again, understanding, which means as a society, we are completely tuned to try and understand in order to accept something. And if we can't understand it, we traditionally have not accepted it. And I realized that as human beings, that's very difficult because as human beings, we are all wholly unique, not just in identity or sexuality, but in all aspects of our complete identity. The idea of my gender or my sexuality, that's just a small part of me. I like to say it's like judging a book by its cover and missing all of the great content on the pages and chapters in between. And our identity is very much like that. So I just say, can you look at me as a human being first? And that's really powerful Because when somebody can see you as another human being, I'm not asking them to agree with me. I am not asking them to tolerate. Tolerate is such a negative word, and nobody wants to be tolerated. We want to be accepted. And the idea is that you don't know the path that I've took, just like I don't know the path you've taken. So I won't judge your path, but I'm asking you to not judge mine either. And can we just accept that we are human beings coexisting in this time and space? And in doing so, again, we don't have to be mates. We don't have to hang out, but we may work in the same company. We may need to just get a job done. And in doing so, when we can accept the human being, which is almost asking to accept without judgment, to start figuring out how to remove judgment, that we actually create the opportunity to have a safe space. And in that safe space, we can have a dialogue. And through dialogue, we can actually get to know each other. And that's the problem is, right, we get so stuck on our points of view that we never get to the middle to talk about compromise and that middle ground. And that's the problem today, is that everybody is stuck on their point of view and nobody's saying, let's talk about it. And certainly in 30 years of corporate, I have never seen a decision made at an extreme. It's always made in the middle. And so I'm asking people, can we come to the middle? And not everybody might be able to. Oh, some of your audience might go, I don't care what that person's saying, but like, no, no, and no. And they have every right to it, but they don't have a right to tell me no, because this is my life. And so they can say no for them. That's perfectly valid, but that no can't apply to me too. And to me, that's where, quote, the red line in the sand is, in understanding that you accept, not agree. And in accepting is the human being element of it, so that we can figure out how to coexist. And really, all we want to all do is just get through the day, be able to do the work that is meaningful to us, hopefully, and, go home in the holiday season, enjoy time with family and friends, and just get on with life. But that seems to be difficult for some people. So the idea of acceptance is begin with acceptance without understanding, but through that safe space that I talked about that we created, which requires work, that in that we can grow to acceptance with understanding, because we are human beings and we are curious. But in order to be curious safely, especially for the person who may be marginalized within that conversation, you need to create a safe space first. And that's what acceptance does. So acceptance without understanding, but grow to acceptance with understanding. Again, not tolerating, not agreeing, but simply allowing us to coexist and figure out a way forward.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things to take in there.
Yeah.
I'm going to reflect. I'm assuming, as that seems to be the case, that your colleagues in the C-suite, as you were in, were predominantly male.
Correct.
Okay. This, for them, may have been a difficult thing to get their heads around.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated to understand, in that male dominated environment, that culture, what kind of reactions did you experience, and how did you manage to change the situation into one that was more positive than negative?
Yeah, great question, Dave. The reality is that in my own personal journey, other than a handful of individuals within the organization that were, well, let's just say they were very much on the no side. And again, I respect that they have every right to be on the no side, but they were imposing their no upon me. And to give your audience some framing of it, the language that was used was like, oh, Cynthia, you've changed your name, you've changed your looks. When are you changing your job? Or you weren't sure about your gender. How can you be sure about any other decision you make? So very much undermining the human being, and, really putting out something that was not reflective of the 28 years of incredible career that I had within that organization. It was just with those particular individuals. Everyone else actually was good. But generally with men, I think there's two aspects that kick in. One is the disbelief that somebody, well, most men will tell me there's no such thing as male privilege. And I can absolutely tell you there is. There is a gender-based privilege that men enjoy more than women. It's not the patriarchy. The patriarchy is the system, and men are a victim of the patriarchy as much as women are. Whole other conversation, but I just wanted to put it out there. In that definition, though, the reality is that men go, okay, if there is male privilege and you were here, you gave that up and went over here. Like, how could you do that? And then because I felt I required medical and surgical intervention. So I've had surgeries top to bottom, and in doing so, many men can't stand the fact that aspects considered very male physically, I did not see as a part of my identity. And I needed to have those changed, and they have been. And it's given me a greater sense of self that I would ask your audience to think back to the first time they looked in a mirror and saw a reflection of themselves, their body, and went, that's me. Most people that I've talked to so far over the last 7, 8 years will say that's in their teenage years. And the reality for me was it was at 52 years old that when I looked and I said, yes, that's me. And it's really been, that was 2018. So it's 2018 to today where I see myself when I look in the mirror. And you know what? Like every other human being, I want to change this or that. It has nothing to do with my identity. It just, would look nice maybe with a bit of a tummy tuck, or, I want to get this nipped or that tucked or whatever. And that's really where we're at. But when you remove those elements that are considered very masculine and you move fully into the space as I have, and again, not everyone who identifies within the trans identity feels they require that kind of intervention. I did. And in doing so, it puts me on the outside that a lot of men just kind of go, I don't know, like they're not sure. And so it's really helping them understand that concept of you wake up and you're not in the skin that you feel in. It takes a bit of work to help another human being trying to imagine what it's like to be in a body that didn't actually feel like yours. And I do correct that because this is my body. This has always been my body. I like to refer to it as I had some birth defects that surgery could take care of, and that made me whole. And that was wonderful. So it's that journey is what I find that most men kind of repel. So when we talk about it, what men don't realize is what do women actually experience on the other side, right? And I talk about it that it was one day I was treated like this in a given situation, and the next day it was here. The pay gap is the perfect example. My pay was never reduced, but the reality was that it was seen very odd that as a female head of technology, that I was kind of in the pay band. And what I first saw was my bonus structure accelerate on the decline to almost flat after 3 years, before I ended up agreeing to leave the organization under a non-disclosure agreement with it. But it was really helping men see what women are experiencing. And the easiest example is safety. So if I was to explain to your audience that when a woman walks out the front door, much as any marginalized person, the idea of having to be hypervigilant about safety kicks in immediately. I certainly did not experience that in my male identity. And then learning literally within 5 days of living as myself, walking down the street, and that was in North America, and the streets are not cobbled like they are in London. So I would wear my heels and everything else. And I had to learn to, for safety reasons, look at the street ahead of me to see who might be coming towards me that could be a threat, assessing who might be following behind me that might be a threat, who's on the other side of the street that might be trying to cross over towards me that might be a threat. Where are the exits to the street? Do I kick off my shoes? Do I pick them up and use them as a weapon? Do I leave them behind? Short of the shoes part of it, as a male, never had that conversation, never crossed my mind. It never weighed on my day-to-day living. But as a woman, it exists every single day, the moment we walk out our front door.
That's extremely impactful, and it creates a picture that, to be honest, I hadn't anticipated.
Yeah.
And I can certainly understand ladies feel a lot more nervous when they move outside on their own, particularly at night.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I've never thought about it to that depth and context. So
yeah.
Certainly takes some get my head around. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
But I could just reflect a little bit in reverse.
Right.
You had a very difficult situation, but you stuck out 3 more years, I believe you said. in that
Correct.
role.
Yep.
Did you manage, should we say, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but did you manage to create a situation where a number of your colleagues, maybe even the majority, grew to accept and understand how things were?
Understand would be a stretch. I honestly think as human beings, we're so complex that very few people ever get to even close to understanding. They can appreciate. I get the word brave, courageous thrown at me a lot, and I fully accept that. I understand why people see that as brave and courageous. But definitely, a lot of people got the acceptance part. And we were able to just coexist and get the work done. And some became better workmates than others. My team were all better, but one of the perspectives that you probably wouldn't anticipate, I didn't, was the fact that I actually had to go back to uni to challenge redeveloping my skill set as a leader and as a manager as a woman. And so I went and took a women in leadership program in order to retune my skill sets, which I developed over 28 years, that were not working as a woman. So a woman cannot take the way a man manages and just translate. Doesn't work. And I had to learn how to apply them all very differently as a woman. And it became very effective. And really, the elements break down into kind of two components in that the relationship between women and so forth is much more, has an emotional layer to it that doesn't exist in men's relationships. And the second is that it's much more collaborative by default. Not that every woman is collaborative, but the simple fact is that it was to bring everybody along. And don't assume that it was a nurturing journey. It wasn't. It was a collaborative journey of bringing everybody along rather than by default being okay with more of a command, dictate kind of mode, especially in an emergency situation, where as a woman in an emergency situation, it was about collaborating and bringing everybody along much more collegially in order to be equally successful getting it done. The second component that came in was, and many people are surprised by this, was when I knew that I was preparing to transition, and I normally had a portfolio of many, many projects that we were managing within the organization across my team members. And I ended up getting to the point where everything was in good stead and was being managed. And I would say I reduced kind of my effort to about 60%. So I took my foot off the pedal a bit and was, just gently cruising down, definitely not pausing, and nobody noticed. Nobody said a thing because I was still delivering, still being effective, the whole bit, because I was saving my energy for what I knew was coming up. Now, post-transition in the workforce, I'm in the role, I'm doing it, I am Cynthia. I ended up ultimately having to scale that up to 150% of effort just to be perceived as doing the same effort that I was doing before at 60%. So more than doubling the effort to be perceived as a woman of outputting the same deliverable. Nothing else changes except their perception.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
You do hear about a lot of these things where women do need to perhaps even be more competitive than guys do. So I think that that statement reflects that.
Absolutely. And the competitiveness that women face is due to scarcity, right? If we look across all industries today, women account for 23% of senior leadership and board level roles across all industries. Some industries are higher, some are even lower. And that says there's a scarcity of roles that women can achieve into senior and board level. It's not 50%. And even if we were matching the EU targets, which were originally set at 30%, now they've been rejigged to 40%. And that's because organizations would achieve the goal and plateau. In other words, they wouldn't advance. Yet we're talking over 50% of the workforce here. So the target still doesn't say 50%. And many are still struggling to try and even get to the 40% target. So in reality, that scarcity that women are faced means they're having to fight each other and so forth a lot harder in order to secure those roles, where men are, within a structure fighting to get the roles in there, but they actually have the ability to actually have more roles available to them. More seats are given to them. More investment, if you're starting up a business and looking for venture capital, is given to them. And we just go on with all of these perspectives. So there's a scarcity concept that women face, which is why we see this idea that women are actually competing with each other for scarce resources. And we see it in sport. Women aren't paid the same. I mean, hopefully we're going to get to the point where women's football has proven that they can draw the audiences, that they can create an exciting game. And we're starting to see that they're starting to be remunerated similar to the men, at least at a national level, not within individual teams necessarily. But again, it's that scarcity of resource which makes that position on that football team such a scarcity that other women will fight for that role versus, well, no, let's get the money in the game. Let's make sure that we have the right models so that women don't have to fight that difficult nature. And again, that's just another example within society of what creates this reason why women behave in that manner or have to behave in that manner. We can definitely learn to behave differently, which is certainly something that I do with the networks of women that I partner, because we're all about uplifting each other as one gets success, helping to uplift others so we all enjoy success together.
Now, we reflected on your journey when you're part of an organization, perhaps just an internal team, shall we say. Now, there are obviously many businesses that traverse the globe.
Yes.
They have a footprint that obviously can cover not just Europe, but the Far East, the Middle East, Americas, Africas, etc.
Yes.
And in businesses where they have such a huge divergence of cultures and beliefs, if you were given a role of helping that business as a whole to transform their organization, their culture into one of acceptance, what process would you follow to help them achieve those kind of targets, particularly when it's so widespread, the beliefs are so far apart from country to country?
They are. And absolutely right, Dave. The reality is that, I mean, whether we looked at women, whether we looked at LGBT, whether we looked at trans, I mean, you're right. The customs within, different nations, within regions are very different, as well as kind of some of the social laws, you name it. They're all very different. And the reality is that in the process of acceptance, if an organization said they really wanted to buy into this, the first question is actually, are you prepared for acceptance? And I make it akin to the day that I had to admit in with a therapist that, I'm a woman in my own body. It doesn't match, but this is my own body. And it's not the identity that people perceive me as, was that moment where I had to be prepared to start asking all the hard questions for the journey. We're not taking the journey. We're just saying, are we ready for the journey? That's the first step. And we know that at least when we talk about for women, when we talk about LGBTQ, when we talk about trans, the United Nations has established standards. And think of this like a baseline. And so the idea is when we begin, the first place we have to do is we have to learn to accept ourselves. So within an organization, they have to reflect on, as an organization, who are they? So this is going to kind of go back to Simon Sinek's why. Why does the organization exist? What's its purpose within society, within culture? Yeah, they want to make money for shareholders, but why are they here? There was a why that they were created to solve. And in doing so, the question is the culture of the organization in alignment? And I worked with some brilliant folks through my history, and they talked about branding from the outside in. In other words, the organization is not who you say you are, it's who others say you are. So it's the exercise of looking externally and getting input. And it's not just suppliers and customers, it's the community, it's the industry that you're in, and getting a wide feedback, including your staff, and then putting it all together to realize, are you who you think you are? And if not, for most organizations, there's a disconnect between their culture and their why. And so you have to bring that in alignment. And when we start looking at it in a very macro perspective, that's when we talk about like ESG reporting within organizations. And it kind of moves up because it moves up to a much more corporate level of saying, no, we're going to look at, the environmental, social, and governance aspects of this corporation. And we're going to kind of bring it all in alignment, because when the first two elements of the why and the culture are in alignment, now the strategy can affect. And I'll give you a simple example. If the strategy that was set without putting in alignment this and said, we want to go global, and you had an organization that culture says, well, we're happy working in the UK and we don't really want to grow outside it, you are going to find a cultural backlash against that strategy. And therefore, you may have some success, but it's not going to be as successful as it could. And so the importance of putting these pieces in alignment come in. When we talk at a global nature, the United Nations guidelines can be used as a baseline across all the nations and all the differences and all the societies and laws of achieving it. Is it the same in every country? No. If an organization in the UK wants to say that they are LGBTQ plus friendly, well, they can't say that in North Africa because it's illegal there. So, but they can meet the baseline for how people are treated and how the culture exists to create a safe space for folks in those regions. And therefore, around the world, an organization is going to be kind of all over the map in terms of where they're at. But what they've done is reached a commonality. And very few organizations are thinking and seeing it at that kind of global scope. Most are not global, first of all. And secondly, it's you really, looking at where they fit, i.e., some companies really focus on being in Western-based kind of countries where there's similar values, similar cultures, and they kind of work. But those that are truly global do face this idea of actually having to establish a baseline. But even organizations that aren't can use that same baseline. And guess what? If you are in a place where you can advance it, then you can reset the value expectation of the organization to maybe a little higher, and not just the low baseline that's at the United Nations level. You can actually expect a little bit more. And through that, they can actually start creating cultures that are in alignment with creating strategies that the organization can be successful. And this is where, when we talk about diversity, we've seen from the big four consulting firms, we've seen it for years now. They've done numerous studies, and they talk about diverse organizations on the bottom line have a 30% performance improvement. 30% bottom line performance improvement these days, I think, is something worth talking about and going after as a way to beat where we are economically and societally. And in doing so, that journey is what we need to look at. And there are models that can be used, how those different levels that I talked about, that organizations, there's models that can be looked at from, somebody who's basically, doing, like in a country where do no harm, basically aligning very closely to the cultural and societal values where they're at, because they really don't have much of a choice, but they're still adhering to the baseline they set as a corporation. To those that may embody the embassy model, meaning, okay, society, it might not be safe to be LGBTQ, but at the end of the day, inside the corporation, we can make it a safe space to be LGBTQ plus. To the final level would be organizations that actually want to help influence the society and policy and so forth. And then they become an advocacy model. That's where they actually step out and say, no, we are going to say publicly that this is what we stand for, this is what we're about. And they're going to try and help influence a change in regulations and so forth in order to create what they see as a much more inclusive society than what they might be existing in that particular country. And so there are these different pieces between the UN models, between these kind of three different types of organizational models of how they operate, that you can look at as you kind of journey through the idea of acceptance. But the first level of acceptance is being ready. The second is accepting yourself. So an organization that would be being sure of who they are. And so when they get to these other things, they nope, this is us. This is a value. If it's the value of inclusion, and we have trans people, it's like, I don't care if you don't like them. We believe they belong, and we want to openly accept them into this organization. And then we have to figure out operationally how that happens, again, within laws and regions and everything else, versus having a model that says, no, we're not inclusive. It's helpful to know who you are going into this, because the next stage in the journey of acceptance is you start asking others to accept your stance. And we've seen how that's happened for some companies over the last 6 months, couple of years. Some it's worked extremely well, some it hasn't worked as well. And that's because they weren't really prepared. They weren't prepared for the backlash. They didn't have the game plan ready to go. And that obviously becomes further steps. The more that they're doing outreach and that they're trying to get to really the impact that they want to make. And obviously, marketing and sales to accomplish probably the goals that they set at a strategic level. So all of those pieces come in. The last caveat I'd put on it is, in my experience in corporations that go, oh, well, we're going to do this work. Okay, we're going to do it for this quarter or this month or this year. The reality is creating an intentional culture lasts the lifetime of the organization. It should be experienced the first time somebody encounters your organization through to when they exit the corporation. And most people do not see that work as a continuous life cycle of constantly validating and ensuring that the organization is true to who they are.
Some really interesting points you made there, certainly about the standards that are out there. Now, try so I can understand, how do you measure success in this respect? Is it something that's very difficult to put into a succinct way of, collating some data and having a score? So how do you measure how well a company is doing, how they're progressing? What's the scale? What's the KPI that you can look at?
Well, there's more than one KPI. There's actually many KPIs that you can look at and implement to this. Many people have written about it. Certainly leading companies that have won awards in this space typically are talking about, dashboards. They may share reports, which gives you a sense of KPIs they're tracking. Obviously, there's a bunch of demographic data related tracking. If there are people who are in the financial sector, the FCA, I believe it is, they've just come out with brand new regulations, which extends that data collection to both a regulatory requirement and even much further than most people are aware of. And so they're kind of going, we collect this data because we don't even collect it today. And it's through those measurements that we actually understand, much like, how do we know what the pay gap is? Well, people had to start capturing the data and reporting it. And therefore, we get a KPI as to what the pay gap looks like in many different vectors. But obviously, when we talk about that, we typically talk about with women what the pay gap is. So within the diversity sphere, we have all of this, what's the percentage of your employees? What's the employees? What does the demographic look like? What's the demographic by job title role? Meaning you will see that, for instance, given the model that we know of, say, women's representation, senior leadership, you should be able to look at the data and see that women are slowly getting removed out of the process. And again, does that mean you've got bad data? No, that means maybe you got a bad process, and you got to go back and look at, well, why aren't women going past? And that may give you a clue organizationally. Well, if they're not going past this level, then what's happening at that level? And you need to, now do the micro analysis to actually figure out what's happening in your organization. It wouldn't surprise me that it might be language based. It could be culturally based, becomes, without the negative, but the boys club, and, women are having a hard time break into that. But the people that are used to it are used to going and looking for candidates that come from the same schools, that look like all the other executives, and so on and so forth. And I always say that, if that's the problem that you have, that somebody goes, well, I want to hire, more Black employees. We don't have enough representation from the Black community. I go, well, great. I mean, you've got a lot of things you got to do, but I use a fishing analogy. I go, well, if you're in a pool and you go, I want to catch bass, and the pond that you're in is only stocked with trout, you need to find another pond. And if you don't know where it is, the first problem you have is you got to go find out where you can find candidates. And most people, at least on the recruiting side, they're not doing that. And then when you have them in, it's like, okay, well, how do we advance? Because, we know about mentorship programs. We know about coaching programs. What about sponsorship programs? Again, there's all of these different kinds of programs that can be implemented in order to ensure that, for instance, we are bringing in the right candidates. We are bringing in women. We are bringing in, candidates or ethnic minority candidates, and we're creating a path to success for them, because we know that the current path is going to filter them out. And so that means you actually organizationally have to start breaking that down and peeling it away. And again, the culture is really a key part of how you drive that, because that speaks to what are the values that you're looking for, that justifies, making the organizational change in order to be a better corporation.
We talked about predominantly big business.
Yeah.
Quite a few of the people I speak to are small to medium-sized enterprise owners.
Yeah.
And they may be unsure about how to approach their employees and educate them in aspects of gender diversity and inclusion.
Right.
So for those business owners that have perhaps limited resources and knowledge and support, what kind of practical steps and advice could you give to them to help them in this journey?
Wonderful question. So I would say that, one of the foundational elements that we talked about, again, for all of the identity, all marginalized identities, is, do you have a fundamental belief in inclusion? And do you want to make your organizational culture a culture of inclusion in order to meet these goals? And if the answer is no, that is equally valid. Now you know that. So you're not going to try and create something because it looks good, knowing you have absolutely no belief in it. And so if you do, then that's where the work begins. That's where you need to understand where you're at. I think it's Peter Drucker had said that every organization has a culture. The question is it the one you want? And so that leader needs to figure out, is this the culture? So if not, the first thing you have to do is go on a journey to begin the intentional exercise of creating that organizational culture that you're going to live for the rest of the lifespan of that company. And that means you're going to need to dedicate time and resource. It's not something you do off the side of the desk. And remember, the culture are the beliefs, the behaviors, and the language that's used within the corporation. So that's where the first part of the education from all of the diverse communities may begin to help people learn. You're not going to go create policy, much as I was part of a team creating culture, even though when I was at the table, there was 3 women and 3 men, but we were all white. That was the executive team driving this. And that's not diverse. We at least had a gender balance, but it wasn't diverse. If we wanted to be diverse, we need to bring a lot more different voices to the table and be able to give them the space to not only participate, but be heard, and take that, as difficult as it might be, and start the process of really creating this intentional culture of inclusion that you want. That's where it goes. And that's going to, again, it's going to challenge you on your organizational values, on your behaviors, and then on the language that you use. And the simple example that we hear about today all over is, if I come work for you, what's your policy on bathrooms? And how do you ensure that I can show you that I legally meet the requirements to be a woman under even today's standards? The question is, how do you protect me in your workforce? And what's your disciplinary policies? So when I talk about policies, it's not just the wonderful, good, warm, we're welcoming and it's all nice. No, it's like, how are you actually dealing with this? And, what does that really mean? I would say the same thing if we're talking, for women. It's, are we doing the right things in order to look at women? We know that there's a bump in women's careers about the age 30 and about age 50. And what are you doing to analyze and break down why that might happen in your organization? And what policies and things can you do in order to minimize that? Because if you're losing those women, you're losing diversity that's not going to exist when you're trying to move them up into higher roles. So you do have to address all of these things. And it's a journey, and it's not overnight, and it's not a snap of the fingers. And you're going to find people that don't want to go on that journey with you. And what are you going to do about that? That becomes another organizational check. What if they're your highest performer, but they create such a toxic environment because they are so against your organizational values of inclusion in the example that I've been using? How are you going to deal with that? Are you prepared to get rid of them because they just create toxicity for everyone else that's still, and they're your highest performer? And I've seen that case many times. And so that's, again, some of the very simple challenges that leaders in SME, small to medium enterprises, need to start thinking about, if they're looking at this journey. The other aspect that I would say is you have to take note of your applicability to your future workforce. We do know that from studies that have been done that those 18 to 24, which are the future workforce, that are coming in and so forth, finishing school, 46% of them, based upon a recent study, suggesting that not only did they look at the talk that you talk, but they're fact checking. Are you walking the walk? They're going everywhere. They're checking. So it's not just, oh, let's say this, let's put up these pretty words on our website. No, like you need to be doing it. And you need to make sure that everyone is experiencing this the way that you intend, which is why you can't just do it once and go, whew, we did that work. Let's move on. No, it has to be embedded. Even if you're giving the fourth quarter financial results, and if inclusion was what you drive, you need to talk about why inclusion is important when you're talking about the fourth quarter results. They have to be integrated. Somebody had once called it, and I love the phrase, you have to embed it in the DNA of the organization. So those are the things, regardless of the company size, but definitely on the SME. I mean, I worked in a company, it was 150 people. It was privately held, so I won't talk about what their financials were. But at the end of the day, they're in that same space.
Yeah, yeah. Now, we've talked about in business.
Yeah.
Quick question as a procurement professional in my position. What about where you have to form business relationships where you have limited control? These are going to be international suppliers, partners. You can't, necessarily exert your own standards, morals, behaviors on those companies. Now, in your experience, how do businesses who want to deal with obviously external parties manage those relationships where you're trying to get this appropriate behavior, shall we say, enforced?
Yeah, I mean, behavior is the one aspect, right? It's really that you want to deal with suppliers who perhaps share similar values to you, so that you're mutually benefiting, because again, from a societal level, you're working on something that, yeah, it's the business, you're buying, selling goods, whatever it happens to be, but you're doing it for that why is a much larger societal impact. That's really where supplier diversity programs become critical. I know that, for instance, here in the UK, there's Out Britain. That's an LGBT Chamber of Commerce. And what they're doing is they're helping businesses, as an example, wanting to deal with LGBTQ-owned businesses and so forth, create supplier diversity programs that can kind of, give them all the criteria and all the process of how to do that. And of course, that then becomes a boilerplate that you just can go from organization to organization. Most larger organizations will already probably have the inputs directly to, your supplier diversity program, especially if you're an SME. The large organizations are most likely way far ahead. And if they're not, then the question is that really the kind of supplier? Can you get that widget somewhere else? And that's really where, again, from a purchasing perspective, it becomes the challenge of looking at the international scale and scope. But even that, there's some amazing techniques. And when I've talked about it historically, I get a lot of kind of dumbfounded stares, because when I step way back into my international trade logistics career space, I talk about the idea of, for instance, tariff engineering. And that was something the organization I was with really started. We had some brilliant minds in the international trade space. I was the support behind this. They were the brilliant, but I was at the table many times because technology was an enabling tool for a lot of this. The example I used was that somebody was in the clothing business, and they were looking to make a pair of women's slacks, dress slacks. And in doing so, they wanted to have the tummy control panel in. This was very early days. It's very common today, but it wasn't back then. And when our organization looked at the design proposal, because we had that kind of relationship, we started to talk about how the garment was being made. And it was made overseas in China. It was being sent to Canada to be finished so that we'd meet all of the various tariff regulations and so forth for transforming and be able to get it as preferential of a rate, textiles typically being some of the highest duty rates in the world. And at the time, the garment, I believe, was at like 18%. It could have been as high as 22%. But through tariff engineering, which really talked about a different way to design that part of the pant, it was reclassified from a government interpretive point of view. We clearly, as a trade consultative space, gave the government some guidance as to how we arrived at that, but they agreed. And it was considered a sport pant. And in being a sport pant, it was duty free. So somebody just knocked off 18% duty by creatively thinking about re-engineering the product design rather than just saying, I need this, which in the role we were in would be an afterthought because we would be dealing when the finished garment was arriving on the border. But somebody said, hey, let's ask for this consultative input up front before we even do it, before we place our first order, before we manufacture said garment. And that's where we redesigned the tariff. So they went and asked for something different and ended up having a free duty rate. Clearly, in early days, it gave them a market advantage, having that extra point, 18 points on their bottom line.
Fantastic idea.
So that's kind of the idea that in all of these spaces, you're really looking for who can bring these different ways of thinking, into that conversation that makes you go, let me think about that, because it's not just doing the same old, same old. And so from a purchasing supplier perspective, supplier diversity, again, is following that cultural value set. It's following the why. And you're making sure that you're actually looking at what you're doing. And that may involve, especially if it's product manufacturing, maybe it means looking at different manufacturers who can manufacture it differently and help you kind of do something like that tariff engineering with the particular product. Obviously, clearly not every product could fit, but at the end of the day, if you could knock off a few points, just simply, maybe changing the propeller on a motor to something else, or perhaps it's a different kind of input. Apple changing its power supplies to the USB-C to comply with EU rules versus, having its Firewire design, right? Like all of these changes, if you can anticipate them, maybe that saves you some money along the way and therefore makes you even actually more competitive.
Yeah. Some brilliant insights there.
Thanks.
Now, there's one final question I want to ask, but before we dive into that, so I see the time is very short now.
Yeah.
Where's the best places for people to learn more about you and your, things you talk about?
Well, certainly on my website, www.cynthiafortlage.com. Certainly find it there. I have a very active blog, blogging at least weekly, if not more often. Obviously on LinkedIn. Love to connect with the audience if they wish to find, hear more. I do that on LinkedIn. So just Cynthia Fortlage on LinkedIn. And you can also find my organization, CAF Services, but all one word, on both Instagram as well as on TikTok. And I have material that I've put out there for audiences on those platforms.
Brilliant. Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Now, we've only got, say, very brief time now. I'm interested in looking ahead.
Yeah.
I'd like to know what you see as the future markers and symbols of success for diversity and inclusion in future decades. So 10, 20, 30 years away from now, how do you suggest we each contribute towards achieving these success factors? What's your thoughts on what should we be looking at in 10, 20, and 30 years?
Great question. So very quickly, rapid fire is with acceptance without understanding. I am putting out an audacious goal starting in 2024. That is to teach 1 billion people about acceptance without understanding by the year 2050. Keep following along, find out how you can be a part. If you're interested in learning more, please reach out and we can do that. The aspect, at least a national level, we look at it. This in 2024, there are 52 national elections for houses of parliament, presidents, etc. There's 55 in 2025. So from a whole political regime, we could be a completely different world over the next 2 years. I would certainly hope that it is people who are open to the ideas of inclusion and acceptance in a way to go forward. If not, then we know we have 4 to 5 years to go in between elections in order to kind of get us to the next place. And next year in 2024, US, Canada, and the UK are just 3 of those 52 nations that are actually having national elections. So again, lots of power shifts that could be going on. And I think ultimately the idea of, rather than focusing on what's different about us, which acceptance talks about, and accepting who we are going forward, is a path, not an immediate, it's not a snap of the fingers, but it puts us like an organization on that path to create societies where everyone can have the right to feel that they belong, rather than feeling they're excluded, they're kicked out, they're not part of. We're all human beings. We all belong. I'm not a religious person. Otherwise, I would quote certain scriptures. But you know what? At the end of the day, all we want to do is just be part of this called society and all be human beings. I don't understand why that's so difficult, but I wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing if I didn't know that it was difficult. And so I am going to stay committed till my last breath one day of doing this work, because it's not going to change overnight. And I'm hoping that I'm here to see some brilliant changes in the future. I believe it because the youth get it. The youth are my heroes. And as they come into the workforce, they are bringing a different way. They are about the collective we, not about the individual me. And they are looking to see all of them be successful, women, men, regardless of their race, skin color, ethnic origin, gender, sexuality, gender identity, doesn't matter. They all collectively want to see things advance and move forward. And we see that today. We just got to get out of their way and let them be leaders today that they actually already are.
That's a brilliant note to finish on. Superb interview. I really enjoyed everything that you've helped us to understand much better. Thank you for enlightening us somewhat, and certainly, tremendous respect for the journey that you've been on and what you've achieved.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So there's another Real Life Buyer podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it, and it has given you some ideas and inspiration for greater action and achievement. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, and a 5-star review would be most appreciated. If you would like to discover more about me and what I do, take a look at www.thereallifebuyer.co.uk. Bye.